I believe we all get to choose how we want to show up in this world. And that is part of the choice. So I am all about raising your awareness and deciding purposefully, how do you want your words to reflect your worth?
Welcome to yourbrilliance.com. I'm your host, Amy Waterman. You would think that after years of being told to lean in, we would be really good at it. We would be able to put ourselves forward as the best person for the job. We would be able to explain exactly why our idea is better than everyone else's. And we would be able to stand up and disagree, even if no one is standing with us. But instead, we are so careful. We make sure we're being a team player. We make sure we're not hurting anyone's feelings. And we work so hard to be liked. Guys don't have to do that. Guys can be blunt. Guys can be ambitious. They can talk over people, but we can't, or we'll be seen as bossy or worse. It's an impossible position, but it doesn't have to be. Our guest for today, JoAnn Lauterbach, teaches professionals how to stand in their power. She's the founder of VATE Communication Training, where she shows women how to use more confident language, project a stronger presence, and say more with less. And today she'll be giving us some practical tips to assert ourselves without getting burned. Welcome, JoAnn.
Thank you, Amy, so much for having me here. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you today.
You teach leadership communication training. You do executive coaching. You work with both men and women. What are the differences you've seen between your male clients and your female clients?
I'll start with the similarities, first off, Amy, which is that men and women often have the same tendencies. So we are talking about standing in our power and using words that are confident or not. And I find in my work that what is same is that we do the same, we have the same issues quite often. What is different is the way we approach the stories we tell ourselves tend to be quite different. Women tend to suffer more from imposter syndrome and trying to get it perfect and saying things in a certain way that speaks to the way we were socialized, which is what you were talking about, not being bossy and all of those things. Men weren't socialized that way. So the way they come into these conversations are quite different. So that's a huge difference. Also, what is different is how the different sexes are perceived when they use the exact same words. So we know that there's a condition called the double bind, which is well documented, where a woman can say one thing and the man can say the exact same thing and throw off very different perceptions. So we get into this area of being seen as assertive versus aggressive. It's a lot harder for women to get right.
And I think one example that springs to mind is asking somebody to do something. A man can say, I need you to do this right away. A woman goes up and says, I would like you to do this, and we really need an urgency. So if you could please get this done for me. And what I have learned from you is that the way I just said it right there, that is self-diminishing language. Could you explain what self-diminishing language is and why we women seem to use it so often?
Great example, Amy. What is self-diminishing language? It is using oftentimes polite, well-intentioned, softening language that either prefaces our request because we don't want to be seen as, pushing ourselves up on somebody or being too demanding. So even though it might be our job, this request we might be giving to somebody might be, within our completely within our purview, and they're our subordinate, and that's our job. But yet, the desire to not come off as being too strong inadvertently gets in our way, and we fall into a habit loop, which allows us to come across more softly because it feels good for us. And then we use that language. So why it doesn't serve us is that for the person on the receiving end, they may not hear the request in the way that we want them to, because it sounds like maybe I don't really need it right now, or maybe it would be a good idea. Like maybe I'm doing her a favor when in fact it's a requirement of the job. So we would be better served saying, I would love to get that report from you by the end of the day as we had agreed. It's not aggressive. It's actually just clear.
Can you give us some more examples of self-diminishing language? Because I think they are everywhere in our language and we just don't realize we're using it.
I think you're right. I think they're in the ether. I have a daughter who is 13, and I take this work so personally. It's not just the corporate women I work with, but it's the generation coming up behind us that says sorry when there's no need to say sorry, over apologizing. So an example of that I've seen in the corporate world will be back in, before COVID, when we sat at boardroom tables and a woman thought through an idea, might have something to add, might say something like, listen, I'm sorry, I just want to add, and then give their idea, which sounds as if they're not really sure they should be even at the table and they have a contribution to make. It casts doubt in the listener's mind. Whereas they could say, in addition to that, here's what I believe we could look at to da 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 da. So they're going to throw off very different perceptions to the audience, and we actually can hear the clearer one much better. So that's one example. Another example would be hedging. So I may feel a little reluctant to put my idea out there because I might be expecting some pushback. So in order to avoid that uncomfortable pushback feeling, I might start off my well thought through idea with, I'm no expert here, or you might know better than me, or I'm just speaking off the top of my head, just spitballing here. Any one of these phrases that we preface our good ideas with might just be a habit that we've gotten used to doing so that we can feel more comfortable expressing our ideas. So that's another example. We tag quite often. I bet you've heard this one, which is putting a question at the end of a statement. Does that bring up anything for you? Can you imagine what that sounds like?
One of the things that I have found myself doing recently, which I never did before, is adding that phrase right at the end of a statement. Like, this is how it is, right? And what I think I'm doing is I think I'm inviting audience agreement. I think what I'm doing is passing the buck over so that my audience can think about my statement and agree with me. But at the same time, it does diminish the strength of that statement.
That's a fantastic example. I couldn't agree more with you. I also think it became very popular in popular culture, and our language gets infiltrated with all sorts of things. So before you know it, you're tagging your great idea with right. It's very common. Would anybody miss it? It's like you're seeking affirmation when you perhaps ought not to be. So if I believe the best way forward is to go in a certain direction, I should just hold the line and comfortably say it without trying to get the affirmation. If I pause, I probably will get it anyway.
So I have to ask you the question, though. You say that these things are habits, that we just say them and they've got into our language. But could it be the case that we use self-diminishing language, we ask these questions, we use over polite language, we apologize because we're not really confident of our voice?
Yes, of course, I believe that's a possibility. So understanding why we use the language is critical to unraveling it. So there are people, Amy, who are unconscious. I don't feel comfortable in this situation. So it might be a particular person that when we start to put our language habits under the microscope, we start to see patterns. So I, in my own example, remember I found I was diminishing around a particular person that I worked with because I felt judged and uncomfortable. And so it was my mechanism to try to have more productive conversations. It, that analysis allowed me to see that that was one strategy. And I was able to experiment with some other strategies to see, could I get what I was after anyway without going into that habitual diminishing language space, because I didn't want to. There are also people who you use diminishing language on purpose as a strategy. And I believe we all get to choose how we want to show up in this world. And that is part of the choice. So I am all about raising your awareness and deciding purposefully, how do you want your words to reflect your worth? And it's up to all of us to choose. So I'm not going to judge anybody for the choices that they make. I think Marilyn Monroe might have made a very conscious strategy to put forward a brand that included a lot of diminishing language. Now, that worked for her, and that's one thing. We get to choose what brand we want.
That is such an interesting example because, so first of all, full confession to everyone out there, I have taken JoAnn's Self-Diminishing Language workshop. And so I've gone through this process of looking at my own language and seeing what I'm doing. And one of the things I see is that I use self-diminishing language very strategically. I use it to be extra polite. Sometimes if I'm speaking to somebody who I feel is maybe a calm or a shy person or somebody who may not have a lot of confidence, I want to really make my words very, very gentle and very, very subtle so that they feel better. I use it around people who I think might be threatened by me for whatever reason, to reassure them that I'm not here to order them around. I would just like to have a discussion. So I use a lot of it there. And one of the really interesting insights I had is that I use a lot of self-diminishing language around other women because I feel like this is the way we talk to each other. We talk to each other in a way that's so overly polite and so subtle. Whereas sometimes when I speak to men, I can actually be that bit more blunt and I can speak more to my point because that's how they're talking to each other. So is self-diminishing language in a lot of ways really wrapped up in feminine patterns that we've absorbed, that this is how you speak as a woman?
I believe there's a lot of that in our socialization, and it very much depends, Amy, on where you were socialized. So I come from Jamaica. I currently live in Toronto, and there's a very big difference in terms of how I was socialized, what polite meant. I was taught to be polite in the Jamaican context, which doesn't actually include self-diminishing language. Whereas I'm raising my daughter in Toronto, where being polite is very much, she is learning, it's about using self-diminishing language. So this cultural aspect is really important, and the lessons we learn and get hardwired young are hard to unravel, but they can be once we move on and we decide, well, does this actually still work for me? Is this something I want to continue with?
And these are skills you teach in your workshop. You lead people through a process of getting more conscious about the words they're using. And you use a really interesting process to help people break those habits and retrain them. Could you quickly explain how that works?
Sure. The starting point really is to understand your habit loop that is driving the words that are coming out of your mouth, because much of our word usage is habitual. So we want to look at how you break habits. And I love the author Charles Duhigg's book, The Power of Habits. And that underpins the work that I do on the program. So the first step is getting a very clear understanding as to what are the cues in your environment that bring on the routine, the habit of using the self-diminishing language. So cues, something triggers you. Routine, you use the self-diminishing language. And the final piece of the habit loop is, what's the reward you're getting from that? Because it's craving the reward that actually drives the habit loop. So if I am craving from the people I work with to see me as a super polite team player who never makes anyone uncomfortable, that's what I'm getting out of it. That's my reward. So I'm not going to try to change that reward, but I'm going to try to see, can I change the word habits and still get that reward? So when I am cued, I get it through using a different set of words. Or, Amy, I could look at the reward and say, you know what? I want to change this reward. I want to instead have them see me as being competent and caring, and instead of overly polite. And that'll bring on a different set of word choices.
And that's something that I have definitely thought about a lot. When I look at why I do it, often it is to create connection and to say, I'm one of you. And this is the important bit, I'm not better than you. That's a really important point. And so what I have to ask myself, the question is, do I want to be able to speak with confidence and communicate my knowledge and help people as an authority? Or do I just want to be one of the girls who isn't any better than anyone else and doesn't really know what she's talking about? And those are issues that I have to deal with.
Fantastic. Such good work. Such useful work.
Now, for those of you watching, do you want to know whether you use self-diminishing language? Well, if so, we have a quiz for you. JoAnn's got a quiz on her website that you can take. It won't take you very long, and you will be able to see whether you use this language yourself and whether or not you might be able to break the habit and become more confident. So we have a link for you to go take that quiz. It's yourbrilliance.org/JoAnn. That's yourbrilliance.org/JoAnn. Thank you so much, JoAnn, for coming onto the show. And I wondered if you had any last message you would like to leave our viewers with.
Thank you, Amy, for having me. I would like to leave your viewers with the words of Cinderella. And you might think, yes, your face is like Cinderella. Cinderella said, perhaps the greatest risk any of us will take is to be seen as we really are.
Thank you. Now, thank you out there for watching. Did you have any aha moments or insights while watching this interview? If so, share them with us in the comments. And for more interviews like these, make sure to subscribe to Your Brilliance TV here on YouTube. And then come on over to yourbrilliance.com for more tips and insights on how you can live your most brilliant life. See you next time.